Welcome to Living Outside the Matrix, the show for thinking people, where we explode the many modern myths of today by questioning important aspects of the mainstream view. Hi there, I'm your host, Nigel Howitt, and on the show today we are looking at the myths and the dogma surrounding cancer. And joining me to discuss this is Dr. Thomas Seyfried. He is a Professor of Biology at Boston College, Yale University, USA. Professor Seyfried has, I believe, well over 150 scientific peer-reviewed papers to his name, and many of them about cancer. And also he has published a book in 2012, Cancer as a Metabolic Disease, on the origin, management and prevention of cancer. And this is the work that we should be focusing on with our discussion today. Professor Seyfried, thank you so much for joining us today, and a very warm welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much, Nigel. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Great. Maybe you could give us some sort of introduction by telling us a little bit about your research, and with respect to how you've sort of picked up the ball from Otto Warburg and his research from last century, because I've heard you say yourself this is not necessarily a new idea, but you've obviously developed his ideas.
Yeah, what we've done is essentially expanded his original work and identified aspects of what was confusing to him, and moved it forward with the new knowledge that we have with respect to the origin of cancer. You know, basically Otto Warburg said from his many publications that cancer arose from damage to the respiration of the cell. And this would force the cell to, in order to survive, it would have to use an ancient heirloom pathway called fermentation in order to survive. And that origin was the direct result of some sort of impairment or damage to the ability of the cell to breathe air and get energy from respiration. Because, you know, as we all breathe air, we get respiration. Our energy comes from our breathing. If we stop breathing for a period of time, we'll be dead. Cancer cells live without oxygen. And this is one of their general characteristics that we see. All cancer cells can live in the absence of oxygen. So the question is, where did that come from, and how is it possible that they can do that? And that's what Warburg was wrestling with. So, you know, in our work, we came about this from a very different perspective, because we had been studying ketogenic diets for epilepsy, and we had been studying calorie restrictions for epilepsy and things like this. And then we've been developing brain tumors and various kinds of cancers, but it was more for biochemical studies, not for looking at the origin of the disease. So our approach to this problem came from more of a biochemical lipid analysis of lipids. So, but it came clear to us that when we put some of these mice that had brain tumors on calorie-restricted diets, the tumors shrunk dramatically. And, you know, at first we didn't, you know, it had been known that calorie restriction shrinks tumors, but the question is why is calorie restriction shrink tumors? And then we showed that it lowers the blood sugar. And lowering blood sugar is what Warburg had said, is that these tumor cells are dependent heavily on glucose for survival. So if you calorie restrict, you lower blood sugar, and the tumors get smaller. And so the question became, and we did some beautiful studies showing a direct correlation between the level of blood sugar and how fast the tumor would grow. And then we would say, well, this is interesting. And of course, it links perfectly with what Otto Warburg said. So the question came, I mean, it's the cancer needs fermentation fuels. And the fuel that is one of the key fuels is glucose. So if glucose is in low supply, cancer cells can't grow very fast. It's just a very simple connection, all linking back to Otto Warburg. But the ketogenic diet is a high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet. And we knew from our work with epilepsy that normal cells can burn ketones. But then when we started to study cancer cells, we realized that they can't burn ketones because they have defective respiration. And that's what Warburg said, that they have defective respiration. That's the reason why they need glucose. But many other people had also recognized that glutamine is another fuel that Warburg knew nothing about glutamine or its role in energy metabolism. Mm-hmm. But the field, and what caused the great mystery in the field was people thought that cancer cells ferment glucose, but at the same time have normal respiration. And this makes no sense in the idea of biology and biochemistry.
Sure. Okay, well, excuse me for interrupting you, Professor, but perhaps we'll get back to that. If I can just zoom out for a moment, just to set the scene for our viewers and listeners. Many people will recall that way back in '71, I think it was, that the famous declaration of war on cancer it was declared a high priority, and since then billions of dollars and pounds have been spent on the research towards along the lines of this conventional approach, which you shall no doubt come to expand upon, and all these drug treatments. So there's a huge amount of inertia with research going in one direction. And the other fact is that almost everyone these days knows somebody who's died of cancer or who is suffering from cancer. Right. And cancer causes more than a quarter of all UK deaths. I'm not sure what the statistic is for the States, which amounts to about 450 deaths a day. And also the UK Cancer Research website informs us that upwards of 22,000 people die each day all around the world from cancer. So just I just wanted to get some perspective on the scale of this problem. So inevitably the war on cancer is being lost, and we need to ask some root questions to reassess where we are, and fantastically this is what you have been doing. So Professor Seyfried, could you initially give us a snapshot of this conventional mainstream view of cancer as a genetic disease, and then maybe we can go on to contrast it more with the Warburg view.
Sure. Well, I think you touched upon a very important point, which is the number of people dying. In our country, it's over 1,600 people a day in the United States. I just came back from China, where cancer has surpassed heart disease as the #1 killer in the Chinese population. It's running rampant. Not only are the new cases increasing, but the amount of deaths are increasing as well. So what that says that as I say, I use the data when I give lectures, and I say the report card on this disease is very bad. It's a F. It's a failure. Okay. Absolutely. And the main reason it's a failure is because people, since the war on cancer, have largely considered this a genetic disease. And this is the failure, and this is one of the key reasons why we have so many people dying from the disease. It's misunderstood. The origin of the disease is fundamentally misunderstood by the majority of people that work in the field. And this explains why. So cancer is a mitochondrial metabolic disease. It is not a genetic disease. All right? So I published papers on this. However, this statement that I just made is so difficult for people to accept, mainly because they have been so locked into a dogmatic view that cancer is a genetic disease. It prevents them from entertaining or even wanting to look at the data that argues against their fundamental dogmatic view.
Sure.
I consider dogma an extremely powerful force on the human mind. We have dogmatic views are part of religion. They're part of political ideologies and these kinds of things. Very powerful force on the ability to think rationally.
Absolutely. About. They seem to be parked somewhere marked unquestionable.
Yes. Well, a dogma is an irrefutable truth. You don't question the foundations of your very religious beliefs. A religion is a dogmatic view of the world according to a particular script. Yeah. Well, in biology, we have the same thing. There are dogmatic views on how certain things should occur. And when all the research, or the majority of research, is focused on a misunderstanding of what the nature of the disease is, the result we have is a disease out of control. It's clear why there's very little advance in cancer is because there's a fundamental misunderstanding of what the nature of the disease is. Otto Warburg had that known, but his work was pushed aside over the euphoria about genetic mutations. So, yeah, and this is, so people are still chasing mutations. It's like the dog chasing his tail. We're getting nowhere. We're spending a lot of energy and getting nowhere. But once you realize that the origin of the disease is a fundamental disruption of respiration with compensatory fermentation, now there's a clear programmable strategy to drop death rates and suffering by enormous numbers.
Sure. So what is the evidence that that you can point to back up your assertion? Is it essentially the nuclear transfer experiments and your work done around collating those? Is that the core of the evidence?
Yeah, well, it wasn't, all I did was take a number of disparate observations from the cancer field over many decades and put them together in a single paper, and then reinterpret the observations from those experiments in light of two competing arguments for the origin of the disease. In other words, do these nuclear and mitochondrial transfer experiments that were done by the most competent scientists on the planet, very leaders in the field, they were just asking, whether or not a cancer nucleus could regulate development. They weren't asking whether or not their observations would support a mitochondrial metabolic theory or a genetic theory, because it was already determined that cancer is a genetic disease. So, and it was very interesting because some of those nuclear transfer experiments, the very scientists that did those experiments were torn because they said it seems like the results from these experiments do not support the genetic theory. But they didn't say much about it because when you have a dogmatic view, you never question dogma. Dogma is not to be questioned; it's supposed to be accepted. So there was only one of the nuclear transfer experiments that actually said in the paper that these experiments seem to support Warburg's theory more than they support the idea that cancer is a genetic disease. So there clearly was one that knew that. But they again discounted. So these studies were dispersed through the literature over a number of decades. And what I simply did was bring them all together in a single paper and then very carefully evaluated the results from each of these experiments, and do the results more strongly support that cancer is a nuclear genetic somatic mutation disease, or whether it's is more consistent with Otto Warburg's theory. Sure. And I think if you look at those data very carefully, you come to the general conclusion that most of those experiments more strongly support Warburg's theory than support the gene theory.
Sure. So if I may interject there, just as a nutshell for listeners, is that these nuclear transfer experiments, and correct me if I'm wrong or elaborate, are essentially taking nuclei from cells and transplanting it into the cytoplasm of another cell, and vice versa, to determine if the cancer is caused by a faulty nucleus. If you put that nucleus into a healthy cytoplasm, you'll expect to see a cancerous cell. Perhaps you could pick up the ball.
Yeah, well, exactly. You're exactly right. These are not terribly difficult experiments to interpret in light of those kinds of findings. So clearly, when you take the cancerous nucleus and put it into a new cytoplasm with normal mitochondria, you can get normal cells, sometimes normal tissues, and sometimes a whole mouse or a frog cloned from the nucleus of the tumor cell without any evidence of dysregulated cell growth, which is the defining feature of all cancer. The phenotype of all cancer is dysregulated cell growth caused by somatic mutations in the nucleus. Okay, and that was not seen in these experiments. And then when you did the opposite experiment, where you took a normal nucleus and put it into the cytoplasm of a tumor cell, you either got dead cells or tumor cells. You never got normal cells. So clearly, it was the cytoplasm that was driving the disease and not the nucleus.
Okay.
Well, this is heresy. This undermines the entire view that cancer is a genetic disease. And not only that, more recent studies on genomic sequencing have not found any mutations in some of the most aggressive cancers. No matter how much they've looked, they can't find mutations in some cancers. And then there's other examples where we have normal skin cells that supposedly contain all these so-called driver genes, but they're in normal cells. So clearly there's so many disconnected parts. But the nuclear transfer experiments are the strongest evidence to date to disprove that cancer is a genetic disease. So once you make that decision, then it becomes nonsense to do most of what's being done in the field. It doesn't make any sense.
Okay, so all of the current standard of care, your radiation, your chemotherapy, and your surgery, all of those, and in fact any other options are excluded, certainly over in this country, I think in the States as well. So that is the only care you get. That none of those three are addressing this mitochondrial cause, and indeed, would you go as far as to say these three methods are actually causing further ill health?
Oh, absolutely. There's no question about it. I mean, we have seen that so many of these poor cancer patients are dying for as much of the treatment as they are from their disease. So the question now becomes, well, if we know that cancer is a mitochondrial metabolic disease, what are the therapies that we use, and how do they contrast with what the standards of care are currently using? Okay, like you've just mentioned, we have radiation, chemo, and we have surgery, mutilation surgery, and then we have some of the new immunotherapies where simply they're just a branch of the gene theory. So the question is, if all cancers are fermenting, and they live by fermentation, and what do they ferment? So it turns out that glucose and glutamine are the two main fermentable fuels for these cells. All right, okay. They can ferment other things, but they're not. In order to drive an inefficient system, you have to have a vast supply of fuel because the engine is inefficient. So an inefficient engine consumes more of the fuel than a very highly efficient engine. So the two fuels that are abundant in the microenvironment of tumor cells are glucose and glutamine. And the glucose and glutamine are the fermentable fuels that drive the beast. So the easiest way to shut down the cancer is to deprive them of glucose and glutamine. Now, it's very simple to lower glucose because we can use ketogenic diets with insulin therapy and a variety of different drugs. The body does not need glucose to survive. We can transition to ketone bodies. So all of our normal cells can be transitioned off to a non-glucose fuel. The tumor cells can't use the ketones because they're defective respiration. So that marginalizes and puts them at a competitive disadvantage. So the bigger issue now becomes, how do we target the glutamine? And we use drugs and we use certain procedures because glutamine is a very important molecule in our body. It's necessary for our immune system, urea cycles. It's an extremely important amino acid. So to target glutamine, we have to use very strategic procedures and do it very carefully. So that you close the front door on the glucose, and then you slowly degrade the ability of the tumor to use glutamine. And what that does is it absolutely kills these tumor cells without harming the rest of the body. So amazing. It's a very simple procedure. So when the time comes at some point in the future, when people realize what a terrible mistake was made, what a tragedy was made in the misunderstanding of cancer, and realizing how simple it is to actually manage this disease without harming the patient, everybody's going to go, what were we doing in all those days? So this is coming. The problem is that you have to, in some way, break through the dogmatic view that this is not a genetic disease. And that's what's holding back the field. The field is being held back by a dogmatic view that cancer is a genetic disease, and we perpetuate this absurdity. And once you realize the biology and understand the biology of the problem, then the solutions become very clear and very simple and very cost-effective.
Fantastic. So do you agree then that it's accurate to say that the primary cause of cancer is defective mitochondrial respiration? Is that the right way to phrase it?
Yeah, that's exactly what Otto Warburg said. Yeah. Warburg said, now, what causes defective respiration? And that's the oncogenic paradox, which has plagued people or perplexed people from the very beginning. How is it possible that so many provocative agents that we know about could cause cancer through a common pathophysiological mechanism?
Do you mean the variety of things such as radiation, carcinogenic compounds, inflammation?
Yes. We know that there are cancer-causing viruses. There's radiation. There's a lot of chemical carcinogens, hypoxia, inflammation, even the genes that people think are causing, like Li-Fraumeni disease, which is a cancer, the BRCA1 that you hear about in the breast cancer. These are all secondary causes. They're not primary causes. Those mutations will cause cancer only if they damage the respiration. Some people have those exact same mutations and never get cancer because the mutation in those people did never damage the respiration of the cell.
Okay, so just to be clear here for the listeners, it's these triggers of cancer, the radiation, the viruses, the carcinogenic compounds. What they do is they are compromising the respiration of the mitochondria, and then the snowball rolls off down the hill.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And what happens is those chemical carcinogens, radiation, viruses, or age, or whatever it is, they cause the mitochondria to produce these reactive oxygen species, they're radicalized oxygen molecules. And these are carcinogenic and mutagenic. So the mutations that we see in the cancer cells are an effect of the damage to the respiration. They're not the cause, they're an effect.
They're downstream.
So they're downstream. So this is why targeting all this stuff hasn't worked and why we continue to pile up the poor cancer bodies, because none of this stuff is all downstream epiphenomenon. It's not the problem. The problem is the cells to survive must ferment. And if they don't ferment, they die. So the mutations are largely irrelevant. Now, the situation is, of course, when the cell can't respire, can't get energy from air. Very interesting. The mitochondria signal to the nucleus to upregulate certain genes, and these genes are transcription factors that open the floodgates for fermentable fuels to get into the cell. So they are facilitators. They're, again, responding to the damage. They're not causing, they're responders. So everybody's trying to target the responders or the effects. And that's the reason why we have so little progress in this disease. So the simplest way to deal with the problem is simply restrict the availability of the fermentable fuels, and the tumor cells die. They can't live on anything else. Okay. They're not adaptable. They're very susceptible to disruptions in their fermentation pathway.
Okay, so that's the way I understand it. Conventional therapies or research is looking at all these thousands of different mutations and trying to find like a needle in a haystack. And you're saying that if we go to the fuel, the metabolizing that's going on inside the cell, all of a sudden we've got one target instead of thousands of targets, effectively.
Absolutely, you got a singular target here. You got a singular target. It's called fermentation. And we've been now our new work is showing that glutamine is a fermentable amino acid, and this is what has been perplexing the field. They thought glutamine was being respired, therefore tumor cells have normal respiration. Wrong. Glutamine is being fermented, and so it's amino acid fermentation. And this goes back to all of the organisms that we had on the planet some 2.5–3 billion years ago were fermenters. We had no oxygen in the environment, but yet we had a lot of living organisms, and they were all fermenting. And they fermented amino acids and things like this. So these cancer cells are simply falling back on an ancient pathway that existed before oxygen came on the planet.
Okay, so as I understand it, the human body has adapted to burn two fuels, essentially sugar or fat. So that's glucose or fat and its breakdown products of ketones. Perhaps you can fill in the blanks if I'm wrong here. So you're saying, or what I'm reading to you, what you're saying is that we can reduce sugar, we can bring that one out by controlling diet. Can you just clarify how the only way to reduce the glutamine is with other specific drugs? Is there other parts of the therapy?
I think that's true. We can't dietarily reduce glutamine. It's the most abundant amino acid in our body. It's released from muscle. It's released from a lot of different organs. It's such a versatile fuel. And when we target glutamine, we have to be very careful because our cells of the immune system use glutamine as a primary fuel. So when you're going after glutamine, you have to be very cautious as to not to paralyze or impair our immune system. Because our immune system and other cells, when we kill tumor cells, those tumor cells remain in the microenvironment as dead bodies, right? They're cell corpses, essentially. So you need to remove, the undertaker needs to come in and remove those cells. And that are part of our immune system, which also uses glutamine. So we've developed this concept called press pulse, where we put the whole body in a press that suppresses the rate of growth of the tumor cells by depriving them of their glucose. And then we pulse certain procedures to kill, targeting glutamine, just a short pulse of a glutamine target, and then pull it off. And then we use certain kinds of drugs that work together with these diets, and hyperbaric oxygen. So hyperbaric oxygen acts like radiation, but it doesn't harm the normal cells. So we kill the tumor cells by the same mechanism as radiation would, but without damaging the normal cells. So we think we can replace the majority of radiotherapy with hyperbaric oxygen. We can replace most of the toxic approaches to cancer management with non-toxic approaches that will be just as efficient.
Great. So no need for hair to fall out and all this other stuff that's associated.
Absolutely not. So what those chemo drugs are doing is trying to stop the proliferation of the tumor cells. But they also stop the proliferation of a lot of other cells in our body, in our gut, in our hair. That's why the hair falls out. Your gut, you get sick, you get diarrhea and all these problems. That's because it's indiscriminately trying to stop proliferation. But if I take the fuel away from only the tumor cell and allow all the normal cells to respire, then we can target the tumor cell without harming the rest of the body. And that's what the press pulse therapy is doing. And that's what the patients, the humans that we are treating with this therapy are doing remarkably well without the toxic effects that you get from traditional standards of care.
Fantastic. So maybe I could just rewind a moment or two just to ask you a question about metastasizing, or maybe I hope I pronounced that right. Is the glutamine responsible for helping the cancer spread around the body? Is that a key factor?
I think so. We think very much so. So we have defined the metastatic cell as a macrophage. So, and this is another point of great astonishment by the field. In other words, they think a series of random mutations will accumulate in some cell, and eventually that cell then starts to spread around the body. This is nonsense. This is all based on the gene theory, which has been disproven. All right. So once you disprove the gene theory, that concept of metastasis goes out the window. So what happens is in a cancer, you have a wound. A group of cells are proliferating because of one of these provocative agents in the environment that we spoke about, and they create a kind of an inflammatory focus in an organ, in a system, and what happens is our normal immune cells, macrophages, come into this environment to heal the wound. They're designed to heal wounds, but when you have a bunch of cells that are proliferating, the very action of the macrophage provokes that environment. It's doing what it's genetically programmed to do, but in the wrong context.
Okay.
And then what happens, they are fusogenic cells. These macrophages are cells of our immune system are very fusogenic. So they start fusing with these neoplastic tumor cells that can't metastasize because they don't have the capability. Macrophages naturally enter and exit our tissues and exist in the circulation and live in hypoxic environments. So that cell now becomes metabolically corrupted. And now you have one of the strongest cells in our body being metabolically corrupted, and it uses both glucose and glutamine to proliferate, enter and exit tissues, and spread throughout your whole body. Okay. So it's one of our immune cells that's now corrupted. And it's a very tough cell because it can live in hypoxic environments, which means the entire anti-angiogenic field makes no sense.
Okay, so hypoxic environment meaning without oxygen.
Yes. So they're designed, they're programmed to live. So when we get a big cut on our body or some wound or contusion, we have cells in our body that can get into this hypoxic environment, kill bacteria, and heal the wound. Well, that cell is our metastatic cell corrupted. So you know how powerful that cell is. And therefore, when you get metastatic cancer, the probability of long-term survival is very, very low. So we treat these poor people with all these toxic drugs, increasing inflammation and creating a perfect environment for the demise of that patient, whether it be lung cancer, brain cancer, bladder cancer, breast cancer. The very therapies that are used to treat facilitate the eventual demise of the patient.
Wow, okay, that's fantastic. So your treatment plan then kicks off with dietary intervention to get the patient into nutritional ketosis.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that and how you measure it? Because I believe you've developed something called the GKI index. Perhaps you could tell us a bit about that.
Yeah. So that you're absolutely right about that. So, and we're doing that now. It's absolutely unbelievable. So we take the cancer patients and we immediately either do therapeutic fasting or very low carbohydrate ketogenic diet, and we bring the blood sugar down. And we know doing this, we target the abnormal blood vessels, we reduce the inflammation, and we actually start killing some of the tumor cells. So it's an anti-inflammatory, anti-angiogenic. So the patient's tumor starts to already get small, and the patient's physiology becomes enhanced. And we use the glucose ketone index as a biomarker system to allow the patient to know when they are in therapeutic ketosis, which is where the blood sugar is low and the ketones are high. Because as I said, all the cancer cells, they need fermentable fuels. Now, it doesn't target the glutamine so well, but it certainly restricts the glucose. So but also shrinks the tumor and makes the tumor much more manageable. Now, we also recommend when the tumor is already shrunken and the microenvironment becomes more healed, that surgical resection can in fact be potentially curative when the tumor and when the physiology is in that state.
You mean literally getting in there and taking it out, cutting it out? Yeah.
Yeah, as if it were a wart or a small lesion or something like this.
Yeah.
So because the tumor has now hunkered down, a lot of it is now becoming restricted from the metabolic therapy itself. And the metabolic therapy can involve hyperbaric. You can do a lot of different things to shrink that tumor down. But if it's still persisting as a identifiable site on PET or MRI, and we know that this tumor has now been bashed by metabolic therapy, then surgeons can in fact resect this lesion and potentially cure the patient there at that point. And I think that's going to be where the future is going to be for many of these cancers, is that we can shrink them down, make them indolent. Now, some of them can be eliminated completely. When we target glucose and glutamine synergistically and simultaneously using press pulse concepts, there is a real possibility that we can eliminate the tumor without surgery, without anything. In other words, it'll just disappear because its very fuels and the health of the body will be contributing towards the removal of this lesion. So we don't know, but this is the future. I don't think we need radiation and chemo for any great extent, because why are we doing those to stop the proliferation? Well, we can stop the proliferation by just removing the fuels. So that eliminates the need for that stuff. Why are you doing that? And it's also toxic. Why are you using something that's toxic? And you should. Why is anybody who has a affliction be given any kind of a therapy that would cause harm, that makes them sick? It's insane. It's nuts.
It really is irrational, isn't it?
If you understand the biology of the problem, you would never do this kind of stuff. The ignorance of the field is allowing us to persist with these very toxic fuel approaches. So I think our approach in the long run, which is called press pulse metabolic therapy, keto adapted, and all this kind of stuff, is the strategy that will eventually make most of the other cancer therapies obsolete. It's just a matter of time, because most people would want to do this themselves. They don't want to be poisoned and irradiated to make them healthy. They want to know there's something else out there that can help them. One of the tragedies is we're not training our oncologists, our physicians, to know about this. They don't know anything.
One of the most exciting things I think about it is the fact that it places much more control in the hands of the patient, in the hands of the ordinary person. When we understand, the description of cancer, as you so eloquently put it, all of a sudden, when you know that by literally whatever you put in your mouth, you can affect your future health outcomes so directly, it's very, very empowering. So once people start reducing their carbs and sugar intake to get into ketosis, could you tell us a little bit about this sort of how goes it glucose ketone ratio index that you've developed, and how that can be used by people like me and listeners who might want to ensure that we don't want cancer. We never want to. We never want to come into a situation where we're curing it or trying to manage it. We want to prevent it.
No, you're right. So now we're talking about prevention. All right, because obviously if we can reduce our risk in the first place, then we don't have to go through all this other stuff in the second place, right? So as I said, we can't get cancer if our mitochondria in our cells are healthy. It only becomes we get cancer when only some cells in a particular organ or tissue develop damage to their chronic. Usually it's a chronic, because acute damage to respiration usually will kill the cell, and you can never get a tumor from a dead cell. So it's got to be a chronic interruption of respiratory function. So how do we prevent that from happening? And you can, the best way, but the most difficult way, is therapeutic fasting. You just stop eating. You just drink water for a week or two. Believe me, I would say the majority of people on our planet would have a great deal of difficulty with this. It's not easy. Oh, it's great to say it, but try to do it. It's not easy. People say, and the older you get, the harder it is. Okay.
So would it be true to say, sorry to interject again this there, but would it be true to say almost literally, if you were diagnosed with cancer, almost the best thing you could do would be to stop eating, to literally begin a 1 week fast there and then?
Yeah. Well, a lot of people are doing that, and as a matter of fact, that's because that will target the cachexia that people get as well, because a lot of people, and that's the other mind.
Which is what? What's cachexia?
Cachexia is when you have metastatic cancer. And even though you're eating, you're losing weight. The cancer is making you lose weight. And what's happening is the cancer is using the protein in your muscle to get the glutamine and fermentable amino acids. So in other words, it's using that to get energy. So, and very interesting, when you have cachexia, blood insulin and glucose are high, and you're losing weight. It's almost like a diabetic situation. So when you calorie restrict and do therapeutic fasting, blood sugar and the insulin go down. So that puts tremendous pressure on the tumor. And if you're killing tumor cells, the level of cachexia will eventually disappear. So you have to play your body organ systems off one another. But you have to understand the biology of the system. So that's one of the reasons why people sometimes argue against fasting. And they say, oh, no, because you're losing weight, you can't lose more weight. But the whole physiology of the body is changing to a therapeutic state rather than a pathological state. So this is the fallacy when you have cancer and cachexia. They say, oh, eat a lot of sugar and carbohydrates so you can gain weight.
Wrong direction.
That's insane, man. It's just not, you don't do stuff like that if you understand the biology of the problem.
Yeah.
So, and that's why we have, you go down to the cancer oncology centers, and they're giving everybody cake and ice cream and Infamel and all these kinds of things, to make them feel better after the chemotherapy.
Yeah. So the again, just wanted to bring back to on prevention, this ratio that you've got between lowering the glucose. And the other thing I wanted to ask you also, perhaps you can pick up, is how you measure the ketones in ketosis.
Oh, yeah.
What sort of meter do you recommend using, and how can we use the knowledge of our blood sugar level, which we know from what you've said we need to reduce, and our blood ketone level, which similarly we know we need to elevate. Can we tie that together?
Ketones. It was also shown by my late colleague and friend George Cahill that and Bud Veach, Richard Veach, still at the NIH, showed that ketones are a super fuel. So when you burn ketones in our cells, we produce very few reactive oxygen species. It's a pure, beautiful fuel that make our mitochondria extremely healthy. So in order to get the mitochondria to burn ketones, you have to lower the blood sugar. Because if the sugar is there, the sugar will often be, the glucose will be the prime fuel, unless you lower the sugar and then the ketones become the prime fuel. So in order to get your mitochondria super healthy, you have to burn ketones. And the way to do that is you have to lower the blood sugar first, and then the ketones will be burned and the body will get super healthy that way. That's why we call it therapeutic fasting, all right? Yep. And or therapeutic ketosis, where the levels of ketones are as high or higher than the level of sugar in the blood. And that then causes the organs to burn. And we have that glucose ketone index calculator that we developed, and allows the patients to know whether they are in therapeutic ketosis or not. So you have people saying, oh, I'm on a ketogenic diet. And you say, well, what's your GKI, your glucose? Well, I don't know. I didn't measure it. Well, how do you know you're in therapeutic ketosis if you didn't measure your GKI? So this lets people know without ambiguity, you know for certain that I'm in therapeutic ketosis. And if you're in therapeutic ketosis, you're going to significantly reduce your risk for cancer and type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease and a lot of these so-called chronic diseases by entering the world of therapeutic ketosis. And I said, some people stay in that zone for a long period of time and they like it, but I always say it's good to visit there periodically, but sometimes it's hard to live constantly in therapeutic ketosis. But at least allows people to take charge of their health, knowing that if I did this, I'm making my body extremely healthy for a short period of time, and you can feel good about that.
Sure. I've also heard it said, I think it might have been Joseph McCullough that said so, that cycling in and out of ketosis can be beneficial, lest with a chronically low blood sugar level, the liver can kick in and actually start increasing the blood sugar level. Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, you'll get gluconeogenesis. Yeah. That's built into our system. But in the case of that's because we have this capacity to make the brain thrives best on glucose, but it can use, because the brain is the largest consumer of glucose in our body, and but it will shift over to ketones quite readily. So the whole concept is our liver will start making glucose from within. Now, of course, people say, well, that's why you can't kill cancer cells by lowering glucose. Oh, no. Because once you transition the whole body over to ketosis, then you can push those blood sugar levels down really, really low, just to barely measurable levels. And then once you're a cancer cell and you need that glucose, lights out. You can't survive without. But the body has to be in therapeutic ketosis before you do that. Otherwise, you put yourself at great harm for hypoglycemia, hypoglycemic shock. So you need to have ketosis. Ketosis will prevent hypoglycemia reactions.
Can you speed your entry into ketosis by perhaps going for a run or something, or doing some exercise to put an energetic demand upon the body? I'm speaking from a preventative sort of situation.
Yeah. That's an excellent question. We're starting to investigate that now. The CrossFit group is very interested in this, and they're very interested to know what the role of exercise at how much when do we use exercise as part of the therapy. And we think that's part of the press concept that we're working on. How well does exercise bring us into the state of ketosis, or can we know we can exercise while we are in therapeutic ketosis, because my colleague Jeff Bolick from Ohio State University is investigating the whole role of ketones in endurance exercise. Mm-hmm. So whether the key thing is, your question was, how fast can we get into therapeutic ketosis? And the idea is you need to deplete your glycogen reserves, because glycogen is a ready source of chains of glucose molecules that could be used at the ready. But it takes about 36 hours for us to get rid of the glycogen reserves, and then the body starts to make glucose from gluconeogenesis, and then of course the body will make a certain level of glucose. But then, because the brain needs so much energy, then the ketones have to be replacing we can't make enough glucose internally to supply glucose for the brain, and therefore we make ketones, which will allow the brain to function on a low glucose platform.
Okay.
So this is, but once you're in this therapeutic zone, to be honest with you, I've tried to get to the zone. But I've only done a 3-day water only fast, and it's pretty tough. But I would probably have to go for a week without eating, and if I had cancer, I would definitely do that. At least I know what to do. It's like having the spare tire in your car and knowing how to use the lug wrench. If you had the flat, you'd know how to repair the tire. But you're not going to repair of a flat.
When you speak of in the zone, what sort of level of ketones do you mean? Are you talking about sort of 3.5? And is that millimolar, measured in millimolar?
Yes. So the ketones are always measured mostly in millimolar, not too much in milligram per deciliter, like glucose is. But the ketones. The highest I've seen on therapeutic ketosis is about 9 millimolar, which is pretty high. And you have to be very careful when you get to that level. It's not that it's still well below what we call ketoacidosis, which is a pathological, dangerous situation. And you usually see that in type 1 diabetes. But millimolar ketone, because you start to excrete a lot of electrolytes. So electrolyte balance becomes a real focal point. People will get cramps and rashes and all kinds of things. You got to be very careful if you get your ketones up around 7, 8, or 9. But most people are exactly as you said. They're in the 3 to 4 range, millimolar range, and that's usually pretty good. And your blood sugar is about 50, 60, maybe 70 milligrams per deciliter. You can do the calculation, and you can see you're pretty close to a GKI of 1.0, which we have arbitrarily used as kind of a point of therapeutic ketosis. Okay. So some people can go below. They can get down to 0.8, 0.7, and still be. My colleague Dominic De Agostino, I think he got down really low, 0.3. He was drinking ketone solutions while not eating for 4 days. And he could put his body into these really powerful states of therapeutic ketosis. But I think most people, if they can get close to 1, will be in a pretty good zone.
So what sort of blood sugar level is that? Is it, or it doesn't matter, I guess, exactly what it is, as long as it's relatively similar, measured in millimolar compared to the ketone level?
You're absolutely right. So if you have a lot of ketones, you're up at 4 or 5. Your blood sugar is at 70 or 80. I mean, you could still be in therapeutic ketosis. So, and if your blood sugar is lower and your ketones are a little bit lower, you're still in therapeutic ketosis. So you do the ratio and you find out how close to 1.0 I am. You are, and you say, oh, I'm about 2.0 or whatever. Well, you're coming close to the arbitrary ideal zone that we predict. And of course, you get some guys they use this as some sort of a competition. They go on the web and they display their GKI and say, okay, guys, see if you can beat that. And they're down below 1, and they look at me. I'm at 0.8, and I feel great. And then some other guy will come along and say, well, he'll do something. It's just the human nature of saying, oh, but can you get a GKI too low? And I don't know. I don't know if that's possible. Because what would that mean? No glucose in your blood, only ketones, right?
Yes. Well, Professor Seyfried, this seems such empowering knowledge. It really seems to not only put health back in the hands, or potential health, back in the hands of everybody, but it also means it doesn't cost you any money, because obviously eating less food actually saves you money. And I mean, my own experiments in and out of ketosis over the last 5 or 6 years, I've noticed that I have much more energy, I have better mental clarity, better dental health. I've heard that there's increased longevity, all of these things, in terms of boosting the mitochondrial health, and then also I'm managing to reduce my risk of cancer. It sounds like a phenomenally sort of empowering, good news, if you like.
Well, I mean, it is, but it's also extremely challenging in an environment where high glycemic foods. Oh yeah, I mean, every one of our societies has things that taste so good, but throw you out of ketosis instantly, right? Absolutely. So, I mean, I was over there at Oxford eating these pork pies. Are you kidding me? These things they sell you, right? I mean, they're tasty. They throw you right with a good big thing of beer. I mean, that'll throw you out of ketosis. Totally. So, and people like that. I mean, you try to tell the guy on the street not to eat that, a big thing.
So it's like the implementation. Then once we've got the theory, the implementation is sort of phase 2, isn't it? And I know I've battled with the whole diet thing. It is a major challenge. I think it's one of the the most personal challenges, if you like, personal development challenges, to master your own diet, given the context of all sugar, as you say.
Well, I think that's why I think the concept of therapeutic ketosis is one is using it primarily to stay healthy. I know a lot of people are using this to lose weight. That using ketogenic diets is probably a weight loss routine. But I think the more important issue is that therapeutic ketosis puts you into a more healthy state. And you do have control of that. And it doesn't mean you have to be in that state all the time. So you just know that this is, you're right, this is something that can empower you. And if you want to, I always said you should try to do it on whatever religion a person is, almost every one of the major religions have some sort of an abstinence period, where you can dovetail your religious experience in with a state of therapeutic ketosis, which is, to me, it sounds like a perfect a dovetailing of two different concepts that are part of the human spirit.
Sure. So would that mean you could get away with the ketosis maybe once, twice, 3 times a year?
Yes, absolutely. I don't think, because I think our environment, our societies, people are fast-paced and everything. It's very hard to be always in therapeutic ketosis unless you're some real zealot, that really is rigid about this. But most people are it's hard for them to do that.
We haven't mentioned autophagy, but obviously that's a part of this nutritional ketosis process where when the blood sugar level drops beneath a certain level. Is that the sort of holy grail that you're after in this therapeutic ketosis, maybe twice a year? So you have to stretch the fast just long enough. Is it day 3, day 4, I believe I've heard people say, and longer, in order to get into that autophagy stage where the body starts doing the clean out, chucking out the garbage, all the dead cells and so forth?
Yeah, you're right about that. And that usually takes a little bit longer. You might have to go to 7 or 14 days before you really, and then of course now you're talking about, really, really tough. But in my book, I called it autolytic cannibalism, but it's the same kind of thing as autophagy. What happens is the cells in our body that are incapable of surviving under a very rigid calorie restriction or energetic energy from the outside, we have to find energy from within our bodies in order to survive. And therefore, every cell in our body must contribute to the good of the whole. And if there are populations of cells or a few cells here and there that cannot they cannot maintain their energetic efficiency, they die and they are consumed. Every one of their molecules is now consumed by the remainder of the healthy cells in the body. So we are simply recycling and reconfiguring as I said, the strong eat the weak. The weak now subserve as a fuel for the strong, and the entire body enters into a new state of physiological health. Fantastic. Now, the point at which we reach will depend on each individual's physiology and how capable they are of reaching these states. And I would say that if you can maintain a GKI of 1.0 or even 0.9, a little bit below, for a period of 10 days to 14 days, you would then be entering into the state of autolytic cannibalism or autophagy. See, some cells will reconfigure their mitochondria internally, but they'll still survive. So that's autophagy. The cell will eat some of its internal organs to survive. Autolytic cannibalism is when the cell is so decrepit and inefficient that it dies, and like a macrophage or one of the other cells in our body will digest it and redistribute the fuel throughout the rest of the body. So okay. Autolytic cannibalism and autophagy are different stages of the same phenomenon.
Okay. Do you think that there's any role for vegetarianism or vegan diets? There's a lot of people out there that advocate the plant-based diet therapeutically for cancer and in some respects for optimal health in general. Is there any evidence that supports that, or is it sufficient to do what you've already outlined?
I would say if you're a vegan and you are on a vegan diet, then measure your GKI and see, because there are some vegetables that have a high glycemic index, and they'll throw you out of ketosis. So it's like anything. I mean, there are low glycemic meats, and there are, most meats are. Well, that's not true, because if you eat too much protein, the protein can be metabolized to sugar through the process of gluconeogenesis. So that's why diets that have too much meat can throw you out of ketosis. So Atkins diet is not the same as a ketogenic diet. Even though you're making ketones from an Atkins diet, your blood sugars are often higher. Keto diets have lower blood sugar, and you can get easier into therapeutic ketosis with a ketogenic diet than you can with an Atkins diet.
Okay.
And I agree. I think there's some plants and vegetables that are ideally suited for maintaining therapeutic ketosis, but not all of them. No. And each individual would have to test that for themselves.
I mean, the Gerson therapy, I remember, was sort of advocating juicing and sort of high minerals and vitamins to make sure that the body's adequately fueled with what it needs as well. I assume that you'd probably go along with things like that. But with the vegan and the vegetarian idea, sometimes that might actually have a lower fat content. It might be difficult to keep the fats up, I would imagine, to stay in ketosis.
But if you have avocados and certain kinds of nuts and things like that, you can bring
true.
the fat. My colleagues have written some beautiful books on the dietary approach to this. Ellen Davis, Miriam Kalamian, a number of these people have written all these beautiful books that give you an array of foods that can maintain in therapeutic ketosis. So it's an emerging field, and I think that the food industry and a lot of dietary groups are realizing, what are the combinations of foods that we can take to bring us to therapeutic ketosis, and also help with our compliance. Because compliance, you want to stay in the zone, but if I'm eating all kinds of stuff that I hate, I'm going to fall out of the zone. So it's a whole process.
Gotcha. So just very briefly, I'm aware that we're running out of time, but which particular form of ketone measuring do you use? Is there a ketone meter that you think is the best form? It's got to be a blood measurement, hasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And there are there's several different forms. We've used the Precision Extra by Abbott Labs. And you can buy the ketone strips and glucose strips on Amazon. Yeah, so that the meter is not terribly expensive. It's like $35. The consumables are what usually cost the most. And now there's the new Keto Mojo. The Keto Mojo is a new meter, and the strips are cheaper. And there are some meters. I haven't checked them out, but we're doing an experiment right now in my lab where I'm testing clinical chemistry enzyme assays for glucose and ketones, compared with the Precision Extra, compared with the Keto Mojo. Okay. So we want the three different measurements in mice that are maintained on high carbohydrate diets and mice that are maintained on calorie restricted ketogenic diets. And then we'll measure glucose and ketones and calculate the GKI under these different diets using the three different procedures that we would have. And then if we can publish this, it will give the population, people in the world, a measurement to know that they can use this or use that, and this is how it would compare. So I think that will be valuable information for people that would be wanting to go down this path.
Okay, and finally, I mean, what sort of, assuming that the knowledge of cancer being a metabolic disease is taken up by sufficient people, what sort of percentage of cancer cases do you think can be prevented, by people simply changing their dietary choices? What's the potential there?
Otto Warburg predicted that 80% of all cancers could be reduced by diet or putting. I don't think he knew about therapeutic ketosis, but he felt that 80% of cancers could be prevented if one were to know how to enhance the respiratory system of the cell, which is basically therapeutic ketosis. He didn't know how to do that. He just predicted that. Now we have a tool and a system to actually do that. So I think at least 70% of all cancers can probably be 70 to 80. I agree with what Warburg said on preventing cancer. What was the second part of the question?
That was it. What percentage of people? I mean, obviously the uptake challenge we've discussed. It's very difficult to persuade people to change their diets. But I think the good news that I'm.
Well, the other issue, of course, is not only preventing cancer, but how much can we lower the death rate by? Yes. Okay, this is, I think, is a really important thing, because most people don't that we all roll the dice. We all think we're not going to be the one to get the cancer, but we do. Some of us and some people. And okay, now I have it. What am I going to do? Now, right now we have, as you've mentioned at the beginning of the program, what an abysmal state we're in. Cancer incidence is rising out of control, and the death rate is going up in all societies. So clearly, whatever we're doing isn't working. So the idea, though, with metabolic therapy as a therapy, not only therapeutic ketosis as a prevention, but metabolic therapy as an approach to managing, I think we can reduce the death rate by 50% if people in 10, 20 years, maybe even less, if people could get rid of the dogmatic view that cancer is a genetic disease and stop all this nonsense with all these expensive immunotherapies and all this kind of stuff, and go for metabolic approaches. I think we can not only reduce the new cases by 50%, but I also think we can drop the death rate by 50%. And I think that would be an enormous achievement. I mean, people would emerge from this healthier than when they started. I mean, we in our Press Pulse paper that was open access, we outlined the framework for how this would all work. And now it's up to the medical community and the physicians to implement these strategies in their patients. And the group in Turkey and the group in Alexandria, Egypt, and several other groups in Hungary, they're starting to do this now, and they're getting unbelievable results. So clearly this can work. It's just that you have to educate people to know how to do it.
Sure. Well, I hope that that the message of this show is to inform people that they do have choices above and beyond the conventional standard of care, and there is a major alternative which makes far more rational sense, which you've helped them see today. So very many thanks for that, Professor Seyfried. Fantastic message, and thank you so much for joining us on the show and giving us your time today. This is so important. As I said, so many of us have lost loved ones through cancer, and from what you're saying, this is preventable, it's avoidable, and it's treatable and manageable. So fantastic news. I really appreciate your time, Professor Seyfried. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
And for all of you listening, I do hope you've got some value from the show today. I recommend, well, it's rather a pricey book, but I recommend, if you wish to look into this further, Professor Seyfried's book, Cancer as a Metabolic Disease, on the origin, management and prevention of cancer. Would I be right in assuming it's a textbook, isn't it, Professor? I haven't got a copy myself.
Yeah, no, it's a combination of text with information. I have to be honest with you, it was written primarily for the investigators in the field.
Sure.
But there are chapters in there that are very relevant to the person. And also, Keto for Cancer is probably the most practical book for people that want to adapt this, by Miriam Kalamian. It's called Keto for Cancer. And then Travis Christofferson's book, Tripping Over the Truth, The Rise of the Metabolic Theory of Cancer. These are more for the layperson. They can understand, they easily adapt these kinds of books.
Marvellous. Thank you so much for those recommendations. And to all you listeners, I do hope you've got some value out of this. And, I hope that it inspires you to question things in the mainstream, because so often, more often than not, I have found that if we simply go along with what we hear in the news, we're not really going to avail ourselves to all the possibilities to empower ourselves and live the thriving lives we want to. So I hope you got some value for this, and I do hope you'll join me again for another episode of Living Outside the Matrix.